actually presenting it. Perhaps you'll want to direct your questions to both Hugh and David. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Hugh, and we'll be going through in the same format as the papers this morning. Thanks, Hugh.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to be talking from back here because it's I don't have one of those wonderful remote control gizmos for running the presentation here. The presentation is sort of based somewhat loosely on a written paper that Dave and I are in the process of writing. I've done the presentation, and so I want to take responsibility for the infelicities of the presentation, even if I want to actually hand over to Dave any difficult problems arising from those infelicities. Okay, the paper is in these 5 parts, which I'll try to get through all of, especially because I want to get to the part which tries to connect some of what we're talking about in the rest of the paper to some of the things that, some stuff of Bob's on Rorty. Okay, perhaps I'll say some, I mean, one of the problems we had in thinking about this was that we could see all sorts of ways in which you might connect the kinds of things we were talking about in the body of the paper to various aspects of Bob's work, and it was really a matter of kind of being ruthless and trying to choose something manageable. I want to take as the starting point a quote from Simon Blackburn. This is a quote, it's the very beginning of Blackburn's contribution to a symposium on realism and truth, a symposium in which the other symposiast is Crispin Wright. It's from Mind in 1998. Simon says, William James said that sometimes detailed philosophical argument is irrelevant. Once a current of thought is really underway, trying to oppose it with argument is like planting a stick in a river to try to alter its course. Round your obstacle flows the water and gets there just the same. And Blackburn notes that James thought that pragmatism was such a river, and continues like this. He says, there's a contemporary river that sometimes calls itself pragmatism, although other titles are probably better. At any rate, it's the denial of differences, the celebration of the seamless web of language, the soothing away of distinctions, whether of primary versus secondary, fact versus value, description versus expression, or of any other significant kind. What's left is a smooth, undifferentiated view of language, sometimes a nuanced kind of anthropomorphism or internal realism, sometimes the view that no view is possible, minimalism, deflationism, quietism. Wittgenstein is often admired as a high priest of the movement. Blackburn says, planting a stick in this water is probably futile, but having done it before, I shall do it again, and who knows, enough sticks may make a dam, and the waters of error may subside. Okay, so that's where it's from. So what Blackburn's trying to do in this paper, as in other places, is to challenge this, what he calls the undifferentiated view of language, which he finds in a number of contemporary writers, but in this context especially in Crispin Wright. And what he wants to do, of course, as those of you who know Blackburn's work will already know, is to defend instead the view that he calls quasi-realism, a term that he coined, I think, which is his own version of expressivism. And he wants to defend that view as the most attractive treatment of a range of philosophical topics. For example, moral, aesthetic, conditional, causal, and probabilistic judgments. What we want to do in this talk and in the paper on which it's based is, as it were, to wade into the river at Blackburn's side, bringing him both good news and bad. The good news is in the form of support for his case against the undifferentiated view, but the bad news is an argument that quasi-realism remains, in an important sense, too differentiated. There's a better, more global form of expressivism in our view. Okay, and then the other thing we want to do, especially here, is to connect this issue to a disagreement between Brandom and Rorty. Okay, and then the next section I want to, as it were, give the background to the issues that we're talking about by talking about the genealogy of quasi-realism. A lot of this is the genealogy of expressivism in general, in this sense of expressivism. But of course we're particularly interested in Blackburn's rather nuanced form of expressivism. Expressivism is often a response to a problem posed by an apparent contrast between two kinds of facts, or more accurately, two ways of looking at the world. On the one hand, the rich world of the manifest image, to use Sellers's term, which has already come up today, which is a world populated by many kinds of things and properties and relations and so on. So values, abstract objects, mental facts, as well as the perhaps more ordinary world of the sparse world described by science. So the kind of problem from which expressivism often arises is often the tension between these two kinds of views of the world. And what we'll call the placement problem, I think this term originates with Frank Jackson, I'm not sure about that, is the task of reconciling the manifest image with the scientific image, finding a place for such things as values and abstract objects and mental facts, all these problematic sorts of things in the world as revealed by science. Okay, so I'm going to give you some pictures as a way of thinking about things. I always find philosophy easier if I can reduce it to pictures, and as you'll see in a moment, I've reduced it to some rather simple ones, but rather colourful ones. Okay, so this is supposed to be the manifest world, and I've used this kind of colour coding to represent three rough kinds of categories of things. So the blue stuff is the sort of causal, physical stuff, the sorts of stuff that's talked about by science. The yellow stuff is sort of abstract mathematical stuff, and the red and green stuff sort of represents the positive and negative norms or values or things of that kind. Okay, so the manifest world contains at least those different kinds of things or properties. I'll come in a moment to what these rather complex objects on the right of the picture are. Contrast that, we take away the norms, take away the abstract objects. Well, what we're left with is the rather sparser world described by science. I mean, it's particularly sparse here because I've only put in three different kinds of objects. There's, as you can see, there are cylinders, there are boxes, and then there are these sort of cloud-shaped objects. And they're not supposed to be clouds, they're supposed to be talk bubbles. Because what they're representing here is something like vocabularies, practices of using words in a certain way. And they're going to play a very significant role in what follows. The point I want to make is that they seem to be perfectly legitimate kinds of things to be discussed from a scientific viewpoint. One of the things that we, as it were, we find as scientists when we study the natural world is that in it are natural creatures such as ourselves engaged, among other things, in certain characteristic sorts of behavior involving the use of certain sorts of words or terms. And the three vocabularies down the right-hand side of the picture here are supposed to be the vocabularies containing the words which refer in order to the sort of stuff described in this picture. And then in the second talk bubble, as it were, the terms that refer to abstract or mathematical entities. In the third talk bubble, the normative or evaluative terms. Okay, so I mean, of course, it's extremely crude distinguishing them in precisely this way, but it's enough for the kind of purposes we have in mind. Okay, so we have the placement problem, which is, as it were, how to fit the such stuff as the evaluative stuff and the abstract mathematical stuff into the kind of sparse picture given to us by science. The expressivist solution is to focus on the problematic vocabularies, not on the apparently problematic objects and properties themselves. And to maintain that the function of those vocabularies, such as the evaluative or the normative vocabulary or the abstract vocabulary, it isn't to represent or describe or refer to some part of the world. Instead, those vocabularies, according to the expressivist, have some other sort of function. Perhaps it's